and welcome to GEC Important Talks. This is a podcast series presented by Global Education Connection, a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to providing children who are affected by conflict or natural disasters with resources like educational materials and art supplies. As part of this podcast, we want to talk about important topics related to children, their human rights, and their education. Of course, neither of us is an expert on these topics. We speak to our knowledge, personal experiences, and perspectives, but there are many credible online sources for further information. Today we have myself, Kathryn Slaughterbeck, and
Carter Beck
as your hosts. And today we're going to be continuing topics that we briefly touched on last week, which are the two recent Supreme Court decisions on affirmative action and student loan debt. First up, I think the biggest was the affirmative action ruling, because it essentially undid 40 years of legal precedent. So first up, we should actually define what affirmative action is. Affirmative action involves a set of policies and practices within governments and organizations that are intended to promote opportunities for minority groups in order to give them equal access to opportunities that the majority of the population already has. We see this in college admissions by them considering aspects like race or ethnicity or gender. Okay. This was recently overturned with the Supreme Court case Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. There was a similar court case brought against the University of North Carolina for their affirmative action policies as well. But this goes back further than just these two cases. Supreme Court has been ruling on this since the 1970s with the Supreme Court case Regents of the University of California v. Bakke, which upheld affirmative action as being a legal practice within college admissions, but did outlaw racial quotas. In this case, the University of California, specifically within one of their medical schools, was accepting 100 applicants, but had assigned, I believe, 16 of those seats for applicants to be specifically given to racial minorities. Bakke, in this case, challenged the school, saying that violated the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court, again, upheld affirmative action as being a legal practice, but outlawed the racial quotas and said schools were not allowed to do that. This occurred, again, in similar cases like Gratz v. Bollinger and Grutter v. Bollinger, which were both decided on the same day in 2003, which again both upheld affirmative action, but Grutter said that it was okay to consider race as long as other factors were evaluated on individual bases, and Gratz again upheld affirmative action, but outlawed a points-based system that the University of Michigan, I believe their law school, was using, that automatically awarded more points to minorities. Like I said, the Supreme Court has been affirming affirmative action for decades. Well, for them to undo this amount of precedent is extremely abnormal for the court, I will say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know recently there's been some major cases that have been overturned.
Yes, the Supreme Court has taken on some cases recently that have worked to overdo a lot of the precedent they've established over the years. So a big part of the argument in this is, of course, the 14th Amendment. Anytime you come across affirmative action, they're going to be like, oh, it violates the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. For those of you that don't know, the 14th Amendment is a part of the Reconstruction Amendments, or might have been labeled Civil War Amendments. These were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were instituted after the Civil War in order to undo slavery by giving African Americans the right to vote and legalizing them as United States citizens, as well as providing things like equal protection under the law. That's where we get the Equal Protection Clause, which is the one most oftenly quoted in these cases, which says that no state is able to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. For affirmative action, most people bringing cases against it argue that by considering aspects like race or gender, you are violating their Equal Protection Clause because you are taking these into account and thus not providing them the equal opportunities that everyone under this ruling should be considered. However, the purpose of these amendments was not to just be like baseline give African Americans the rights that they should have had since coming here to begin with, but also to help them assimilate into a post-slavery world. Like I've said, it goes beyond just race. It's considering gender, it's considering all of these other aspects that might not have previously been considered in order to create a direct investment in promoting diversity. That is the explicit purpose of affirmative action, to promote diversity on college campuses. And by promoting diversity on college campuses, you then promote diversity in the legal system, in the medical system, and all of these areas where you need a degree in order to access. You're then able to create more opportunities for people of color, for Asian Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for even women or LGBTQ plus folk to access these higher degrees and then be able to access these these not as easily accessible jobs, if that makes sense. So that's the direct reason why in the ruling the Supreme Court said that it was okay for military academies to still use affirmative action because they have a direct investment in promoting diversity among military leadership. It's an important part of life. That goes without saying. So it's not just, giving people of color a couple more points in the system to make sure that they might be able to access college a little more easily, but also recognizing the importance of having a diverse campus, of having a diverse workforce, as well as giving them the leg up that they might not have had because of institutional biases within their schooling system, within their community, things that might have made it much harder for them to access the same quality of education that other people did. So it's more than just considering race, but also helping undo the legacies of the past that are still here in the present.
Kathryn, you mentioned that in the ruling, they still allowed the use of affirmative action in military academies, but yet they banned the use of affirmative action for admission in other colleges, universities. Why do you think they continued to allow affirmative action in military academies? And so I guess why do you think that they continued to allow it in military academies compared to the status quo up until last week?
Honestly, I don't have a good reason. Like, why is it okay for the military to have diverse leadership, but not for corporate executives or for medical boards or for the American Bar Association? They need the diversity as much as the military does. So personally, I don't think there's a legal basis for this. Like,
And
why is the military allowed to do this, but other schools aren't? Like, it makes no sense to me.
was it referenced at all in any of the opinions that you read?
So it's actually a footnote in the majority opinion that they like it's not in the main body of the text. It's like a little like asterisk, and then you go to the very bottom of the page, or in the tiny font, you'll see, oh, BTW military academies are still allowed to do this. Don't worry about it. And that is explicitly the reason that they give, because the military has a direct investment in promoting diverse leadership. That is the explicit reason that they give for allowing military academies to still use affirmative action. So it's completely baffling to me that they understand the importance of diversity within military leadership, but not in other leadership.
Yeah, so that's something that's very interesting, because by doing so, they're saying that public universities do not have a direct interest in promoting diversity. All it is
Yeah.
applying the inverse of their argument.
Yeah. And everyone argues against affirmative action by saying, oh, college admissions should just be based on grades, and your SAT scores. But if every single person in the United States had access to the same quality of education, to the same quality of SAT prep, to the same quality of assistance at home to get that that quality of education that's needed, plus access to, after school programs or volunteer opportunities to help boost your resume and become the person that these colleges want, then I'd say totally. It should only be on the qualities that a student can bring to the table with their grades. But we do not live in a country where everyone has access to the same quality of education. People at a public school in the middle of nowhere are not going to have the same quality of education as a rich private school in New York City or even a public school in New York City. Every single school is different and everyone provides a different standard of learning. And that even varies from state to state. Not every state has the same requirements for what kids need to learn, what grades they need to reach, what scores they need to get on standardized testing. So again, if we lived in a world where all of that was baseline and everyone had access to the same education, the same SAT prep or ACT prep, if the SAT or ACT were free and were more easily accessible to people of the lower class who, don't have $80 to pay out of pocket for one exam, then I'd say, sure, maybe it would be more reasonable to not have to consider these other factors. But we don't live in that world.
Well, also by promoting, and if the college admission process was to only go based off of high school grades and SAT or ACT scores, you're really only it's really only benefiting students that are good at test taking or are really good at their academic coursework. Some
Yeah.
students are not necessarily going to be the best test takers. However, that does not diminish from their academic abilities. So I think that's a skewed and flawed way of proceeding with college admissions.
Yeah, like if we had an education system that understood that not everyone learns the same exact way, that not
Mhm.
everyone can be tested the same exact way, then we'd be having a different conversation.
But
But
also,
we don't have it.
I do admit that would be a very big undertaking to try to
Yeah,
develop a system where it just standardized testing is just the very simplest and easiest way to objectively measure all students. And however, it is not. That does not mean that it's a perfect way of measuring students. However, it's just an easy way of measuring them, which is why I
yeah,
think that it is the status quo for college admissions.
yeah, exactly. Like, some kids are just not your like the standardized state testing that everyone's required to take in school. Some kids
Mhm.
are just not going to bother on that, because it doesn't affect their grades. It doesn't affect their chances at getting into college. Like, I didn't
Mhm.
have to submit my Keystone scores to any of the colleges I was applying to.
Mhm.
So, what's the point of them beyond trying to measure something that is genuinely hard to measure by tests? Even as someone who does okay in a traditional education style classroom, like, I still don't like tests. I still don't like taking them. So I can't imagine like the people who genuinely do struggle with that, with whether it's the structure of the tests or even just test anxiety. Like, I know
Mhm.
countless people who struggle on exams just because of how anxious they get, like
And
because
then
of how they're set up.
the
Yeah,
result
like,
the results of that impacts their chances of different colleges that they if they choose to go.
exactly. Plus, I think how we issue standardized testing is just awful. I remember taking the SAT. That was objectively like the worst like 6 hours of my life. You mean
Objectively,
I
that
get
was the worst.
Yeah, you mean I want to sit in
Objectively.
a classroom for like 6 hours staring at this booklet of like the worst questions I've ever read while I get like one break to drink out of the water bottle I brought and like the Reese's peanut butter cups I had shoved in my purse because I
Mhm.
didn't know the exam was going to take 6 hours and didn't know I needed to bring more food, and we didn't have a vending machine at my school and they didn't provide us any food. Yeah, I can't. Gosh, there's a reason I only took that once. Like,
So I think it can very easily say that the current college admission process is highly flawed
yeah,
because it relies so heavily upon a simple score that a student may receive in their ACT, SAT scores, plus also the collective scores for how they did with their test taking abilities throughout their high school education. So I think that the college education system is flawed if it relies solely upon that. So all this speaks to is that this is a very complex issue and it needs to be addressed sooner rather than later.
I mean, affirmative action was one of the ways people were trying to address it. Was it perfect? No. That's
Mhm.
why we had so many cases challenging it. But it was at least a step in the right direction to acknowledging the structural inequalities in the United States and how we can help students who may otherwise not be able to get into schools because of outside factors reach the levels of education that they deserve.
Kathryn, in preparation for this show today, I know we both did some research about affirmative action. I want to pull up some statistics from Pew Research Center. This was written on April 26, 2022 by Vianney Gomez. Kathryn will also include this in the show notes. It showed some really interesting figures related to people's perceptions about what should be important when it comes to when it comes to the factors that need to be considered in college admissions. 61% of all the respondents said that high school grades are a major or should be a major factor to be considered. Only 4% of respondents said that gender should be a major factor, and 7% said that race or ethnicity should be a factor. I'm going to quote the article now, more than 9 in 10 Americans, 93%, said the high school grades should be at least a minor factor in the admission decision, including 61% who said that it should be a major factor. So there's definitely a consensus that high school grades are very important. And that's what we saw from these figures. But what was really interesting to me, and this ties directly into affirmative action. About 8 in 10 white adults, 79%, say that race or ethnicity should not be a factor in the admission decision. By comparison, 68% of Hispanic adults say this, as do 6 in 10 Asian Americans, or 63%, and Black, 59%. While 87% of Republicans say race or ethnicity should not be a factor in admissions, that share falls to 62% among Democrats. So 87% of Republicans say that race should not be a factor, and 62% of Democrats say that race should not be a factor. I'm going to go on a little bit more. While 3/4 of Americans say that having a relative who attended the school, so now we're talking about legacy admissions, should not be a factor, white adults, 80%, are more likely than Hispanics and Black and Asian Americans to say this. So in terms of legacy admissions, white adults, more than any other race or ethnicity, said that legacy admissions should not play a factor. To me, these statistics were very interesting, and I did not expect them.
Yeah, it's definitely like oh my god, I forgot the word.
Mind-boggling?
Yes, there we go. Mind-boggling.
Well, so
To sit down and
I just
read
threw a
them.
whole bunch of information out there.
Yeah,
And it's a lot to analyze, and I highly recommend anyone listening should definitely take a look at this article, because to be able to see these figures on a chart, it's really, really interesting to see how it's broken down, because it's broken down to what people think should be a factor, less of a factor, and then not a factor at all. And so we saw from this that the majority of Republicans and Democrats agreed that race should not be a factor, not even that it should be a little bit of a factor, but not a factor at all. And this was from Pew Research, who I trust, and I think that they are an objective source of information. So I do trust their data, but I think it's also worthwhile to follow up on this and say, okay, why did people respond the way they did? And I think it can lead to very interesting conversation.
definitely. Yeah.
So, but I was not expecting those figures, like I said.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that either until you brought it up.
Especially from, I mean, so you can make the argument where it's a partisan argument saying that, okay, Republicans might believe one thing, Democrats might believe another thing, but yet we saw consensus in the fact that more than half of and not even like 51 or 52%, it was like 60%, 80%, they agreed that race should not be a factor. So I didn't expect that kind of consensus from some you can say political rivals.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see that this is the thing that both sides of the political spectrum can come together on.
out of everything, they
Out of
agreed on
everything.
this. But
Yeah.
also the legacy admissions too. I know that's going to be called into question now that schools cannot factor in race or ethnicity with affirmative action. Schools still take into account legacy admissions, and so
I do believe someone is actually bringing a case against Harvard for their legacy admissions
Okay.
policy. So
So
we will
so we'll
see how
see.
that gets ruled on.
Yeah. And but what we also saw from the survey was that the majority of adults in America believe that legacy admissions should not be a factor as well. So I think more people believe that grades should be playing the major factor in college admissions. Looked like it was pretty evenly split with standardized test scores. Community service definitely is a minor factor, and then it went into athletic ability was pretty much split, almost 50-50. But I did not expect the stats on race, ethnicity, legacy, and then gender.
Yeah. And hopefully, as we move forward and can make more progress addressing, systemic inequalities, things like race and gender won't have to matter in college admissions. But I think where we are right now, things like that are still important to consider, especially given, like I said, the current education system that,
Mm-hmm.
not everyone has access to the same stuff. You know, like
And
my
that just
best friend from
confuses me
college,
because this.
yeah, my best friend from college
No, no, sorry.
like
Go ahead.
attended a college prep high school where she was rigorously
Mm-hmm.
prepared for college and like for the I think it was the ACT. I think she took the ACT. But
Mm-hmm.
like I didn't have that, I went
Yeah.
to a tiny public school in the middle of nowhere where it was like I got to take the SAT for free because the college board gave my school SAT fee waivers because of how poor my area was. Like,
Wow.
so I obviously, like, the two of us clearly had a different quality of education provided to
Mm-hmm.
us, but I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
still ended up at the same place.
Yeah.
Um, but still, like, until we are able to fix the inequalities within the education system, I think there's so much more we need to consider with admissions beyond just grades and test scores.
And like you said, from the small asterisks at the bottom of the opinion, military academies need to promote or have a direct interest in promoting adversity, which is why they're taking into account more than just grades from high school SAT and ACT scores. So I'm still trying to grapple with that the reasoning behind why they're allowing it there and not at universities.
I have a comment I could make, but it's not appropriate for a podcast, so we're just gonna move on.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I
But
think the other, yeah. Let's talk about the other major case.
well, I was just going to like add on a little bit that
Mhm. Oh
technically
yeah, of
the
course.
Supreme
Yeah, yeah.
Court said that race still can be considered in admissions. It just has to be considered within essays. Like students can write about
Mm,
how race affected them or their experiences with it. That can be taken into account only if it's written during the essay portion. You just can't check off a box on your application saying, "Hi, I'm white."
yeah.
So it's they're still like saying it's okay to consider race, just not as openly as before. I guess if that makes sense.
hmm Thinking like solution wise. I mean, we're bringing up the issue. Would you have a proposed solution for what could help to address this?
Not really. I think it's
Mhm.
it's such an ingrained system in our college admission system, in our entire K through 12 education system that it would take a lot to just try and fix it. I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of little things that could be done. Like I said, baseline education for, the entire 50 states. So like at least so that kids in public schools are all receiving the same quality of education or at least attempting to receive the same quality of education. I think that's a step in the right direction. um, but it's such a bigger issue than just race or gender that it
Yeah.
would require a lot of work to fix. So,
I think
but
my thought behind this is if they're going to, well, they since they did ban the use of affirmative action, which was to promote equality and diversity for college admissions, and because so my reasoning I guess my thought process is if they're going to ban that, the purpose of that was to help alleviate some of the disparities that many kids faced in their education growing up. So by eliminating that, you need to you and when I say you, I think the government, states, communities need to more heavily invest in their education systems, because affirmative action is no longer a way to promote equality and diversity in colleges. So I think then the responsibility falls on the education system to almost
Shape up.
exactly, to put it bluntly, shape up, to invest more heavily in pre-K developmental programs, arts programs, and provide more opportunity to kids. So that way, a kid growing up in a poorer neighborhood does not have the opportunities that a kid might growing up in a more affluent neighborhood. So by that, communities, states, and the federal government need to invest more heavily to ensure that inequality in colleges is not going to become a greater issue.
Yeah. With this, next wave of college students coming in, it'll be definitely interesting to see how the ruling impacts college admissions for this
Mm-hmm.
next year. Like,
Absolutely.
will this be more of an issue in certain states than others? Will this be a bigger issue in public schools or private schools, or will it not really matter? Will we just see this disparity grow everywhere, or will some
Mm-hmm.
schools find clever ways to try and get around it? I know Harvard has already said that they're going to try to. So it'll be interesting to see the moving forward how schools deal with this, especially
Mm-hmm.
because they schools still for the most part want to promote diversity. At least
Yeah.
from my understanding, a lot of that's what a decent number of schools are still interested in, because
Well,
again,
apparently the military academy says
I
it's they
mean,
have a
yeah,
direct
the
interest.
military academies are doing it like that. It's the hot new craze, like that everyone should be doing. So because college isn't just about going and like taking a set number of classes to get a degree. It's also to
Mm-hmm.
introduce you to new viewpoints and to develop your critical thinking skills, to
Mm-hmm.
help you in the workforce. It's not so you leave a closed-minded person. It's to help you broaden up your worldview to see life and your career and all the things that you've learned so far differently. So in a way to do that is obviously diversity. A way you can
Mm-hmm.
increase your perspective is to speak to other people. And if you get just a school of all white kids who all have the same socioeconomic background, who all have the same quality of education, who all did the same extracurriculars, they're not going to learn that much from each other. Like it's just going to be like the same baseline of they all are the same person, different font. But
Mm-hmm.
by introducing them to international students, by introducing them from students from all 50 states, from all different walks of life, you are creating someone who has a much more, you know, widened worldview, which is like the big point of college. It's like I said, not to just go and walk out with, my silly little political science degree. It's so I can say, yes, I went and I did learn these things, but I also developed my speaking skills. I developed my critical thinking skills. I met so many different
Mm-hmm.
people from so many diverse backgrounds that I can now say, oh, I look at life differently. That is the whole point of higher education. It's not like K through 12 where you learn, I'm not going to
Like,
my math class to learn 2 plus 2 equals 4 anymore. Like I said, it's to build on
mhm.
the skills that college is trying to teach you.
Yeah. And I think that what's an interesting opportunity, if you want to look at it like this, is if colleges and universities do want to promote university because it is in their direct interest to do so, it puts it puts the responsibility on them to figure out how they can adopt a more equitable admissions process. So, thinking optimistically, that's I think that's actually a good step, is because they need to overhaul the admission process so that way there can be more equity and diversity in colleges rather than just taking into account test scores rather than just taking into account some of the other factors that the Pew Research study highlighted. And so, optimistically, this might be a great opportunity for the college system in the U.S.
Definitely. It'll be interesting to see
Yeah.
where it goes from here.
Yeah.
I'll
Absolutely.
update after I apply to law school.
What? There was another big case that was hitting headlines this week.
That I know
Would you like to
every millennial and
elaborate a little
Gen
bit on
Zer in
that?
the United States is shaking their fist at.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
the other case was Biden v. Nebraska, which was, of course, a bunch of Republican attorney generals from multiple states, not just Nebraska, challenging President Biden's student debt forgiveness program. This program had been implemented through using the Secretary of Education and the extent of their powers under the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students Act of 2003, which authorizes Secretary of Education to waive or modify any requirement or regulation applicable to the student financial assistance programs under the Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965 as deemed necessary with respect to an affected individual. That is directly from Congress.gov's breakdown of the bill. This has been in place, like I said, since 2003. It was officially codified into law in 2007, so this is not something new. This is just President Biden took the opportunity to try and use this to waive at least $10,000 for most student debts, though it was upwards of $20,000 for some individuals. So basically, the Supreme Court said, nada, no way, Jose. Not allowed to do that here. You're overstepping your power. You can't do that. So, of course, Biden is now trying to find other ways to alleviate student debt. Most of that has so far been with setting up a new repayment system, or I think, and then for the next year, if you miss a payment or can't pay, it's not going to affect your credit score. So these are all steps in the right direction, but I think it's a much bigger issue than just trying to cancel student loan debt.
Yeah,
Because,
I think with the whole, I mean, I think the whole argument with cancellation of student loan debt is that I think the government is admitting, hey, there's a big problem, and it's at the point where it's impacting millions of borrowers. It's going to have a major economic impact with people defaulting on their loans, not contributing in other aspects to the economy. And so I think with the whole conversation underlines that there is a major issue with student loan debt in the United States.
yeah. And obviously, the extreme cost of college ties into that, which we briefly discussed last
Mm-hmm.
week. But honestly, my major issue isn't with necessarily my loans themselves, because I took out that money knowing I would have to repay it. I took out that money to get the education that I want and that I need for my future. My biggest issue is with the extreme interest rates. I'm sorry, why am I paying 7% interest on my loans? You told me for a year. I came out of the womb and you looked at me and went, she's going to college one day. You know, everyone hammers home, you have to go to college to get a future in the United States. Literally, anytime I turned around in school, everyone was like, you should be a lawyer one day. You need to go to college for that. So, I had always prepared for this, but then, you sign the paper saying, hello, yes, I will sell you my soul in order to go to school. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, I'm about to pay almost 7% interest on these loans forever. So, like, trying to pay off those loans is practically impossible because you're just paying the interest and never actually paying anything off of the principal, meaning that what you owe is just going to keep going up and up and up and up because your interest is affecting that amount. So you're just never going to pay off that loan. So my big plan is just either cut the interest rates or get rid of it entirely. Just let me pay you the money I borrowed. You're the government. Politely, why are you charging me an interest rate? You know?
Yeah, it is. It is quite peculiar that the government is in the business of making money off of students. And when I say making money, I mean by charging interest. Because we know, like with a bank, if you go to buy a house, you take out the mortgage, and there's interest attached to that mortgage, which is the bank's way of being able to generate revenue for borrowing, for lending out their money. But why would the government be in the business of making money off of students when it simultaneously promotes the idea of of going to college? So the government's saying you need to go to college. It's in the best interest of everyone, for the economy, for the country, to go to college. But at the same time, we're going to be making money off of you while you do that. So I do also have a problem with that. And I think, yeah, I think our loans are also 7%. And we knew when we were going to be in debt by going to college. So we knew that. But kind of we do that. We go to college because we know that statistically it's going to lead to higher paying job opportunities throughout our careers.
Yeah, and then you spend the rest of your career trying to pay off the loans that you took out in order to get that career in the first place. And it's like,
And that
can I
wouldn't be
just.
the case if
Oh, no, go
well,
ahead.
that wouldn't be the
Sorry.
case if interest was not attached. Like if it was like an interest free loan, maybe like the government providing a service, providing an interest free loan, that students would not be burdened with the interest accumulating and possibly becoming larger than the actual initial loan size, which we do see.
Yeah. Or, like I said, even if they just cut the interest rate to like 1 or 2%, that wouldn't be horrible
Mm-hmm.
because then you could still pay the interest while chipping away at the principal amount. But with how high the interest is now, for most people, they can't feasibly make enough money to chip away at the principal amount enough to not keep accumulating more and more debt.
Yeah. What
So
if
it's,
the
it's this
interest
horrible
rate
cycle.
was what if the interest rate was an adjustable rate interest where it was attached to or reflective of GDP?
Ha, imagine that.
So at the point where at the point where the economy is very strong, GDP growth is at maybe 5%. Interest rates for the student loans would be at 5%. Or at the point where the economy is in a recession, there's negative interest rates or very small interest rates. I think right now we're at like a 1 or 2% GDP. To me, that would be that sounds a little more equitable.
And definitely more reflective of, what people can actually pay.
Yeah, especially because when the economy is strong, typically people have better paying jobs and they're spending more money, hence higher GDP.
Yeah.
But in times of recession, people are typically trying to either find jobs or save money because of certain scarcity, like a scarcity mindset. In times where things might not be as good, and maybe at that point there's a break with interest where you might have a low or negative interest rate. That was just a crazy thought I had.
Yeah, that would make sense. But, of course the government isn't doing it.
Well, also in preparation for today's episode, I got some small figures from Forbes. This was an article last updated June 30th, 2023, and this was written by Alicia Hahn and Jordan Tarver. Says that there's currently $1.75 trillion in student loan debt, and that includes federal and private. On average, the average borrower in the US owes $28,950. So out of everyone that currently has student loan debt, the average is 28,950. So those are just two quick statistics to kind of give people an idea of the magnitude of current student loan debt for the average borrower, plus also the sum, $1.75 trillion. So that's larger than the GDP or the that's larger than the GDP of many countries.
Plus, that amount of student loan debt goes up for people who want to pursue things like medical school or law school. Um, sure, they end up making more money to reflect how much time and effort they put into that degree, but they're still like that's still a huge amount of debt to carry with you. Um, and again, like with these
So,
big name schools like Harvard or Yale or anything, they charge a huge tuition just for like the name price of the school. So
mhm.
again, reflecting on our conversation last week about quality of education, how much money you're putting into it, that again reflects how much money you take out in loans.
I looked up the total GDP of Canada is less than the total student loan debt that currently exists in the U.S. So, kind of put that into perspective. The only countries in the world that have a greater GDP are Italy, Brazil, France, the UK, India, Germany, Japan, China, and then the US. So, out of almost all the countries in the world, except for maybe seven, the total student loan debt is more than their economies can produce in a year.
Which is completely insane. Like that should not be the case.
Mhm. Yeah, and that speaks to a major issue in the college process, which is the cost and the growing cost based off of the interest rates.
Yep.
Uh, well, addressing that issue, I know we proposed that a possible solution would be reductions in interest rates. I agree. I think that would be a great stepping stone in the right direction. Um, and any other possible solutions that you can think of?
I mean, a big thing would just be colleges cutting the cost of tuition.
Hmm.
Make college cheaper, you don't have to take that much out in loans. But
That is
then you'd
true.
actually have to make colleges show where all the money you're giving them is actually going.
No, no, no,
Like,
no.
do you actually need the $70,000 a year I'm giving you, or are you just like
Opening
is
a
that
can of
going
worms.
to the rowing coach's like $1 million a year salary, or you know,
You're opening up a can that no one wants to be out in the open.
yeah, that all the colleges are currently trying to beat with a hammer, so no one can pry it open.
Yep. Yep.
So there are a lot of issues that go into it, but I definitely think that the what we suggested with interest is
Hmm.
probably the best way to at least start addressing the issue. Um, and I know like the government obviously can't control how much private schools cost, but hello, like they probably have some form of input into the public schools. So could at
Yeah,
least
I
be
mean
working with public
one of the
schools to lowering the
statistics.
tuition.
Yeah, one of the statistics on here was 55% of students from public four-year institutions have student loans. 57%, so just a little bit more, from private nonprofit four-year institutions took on debt as well. So over half of students have student loan debt for public and private nonprofit institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's definitely a very big issue that needs to be addressed because, you
Mhm.
know, what, two generations now of students are bogged down by student loan debt that they might not ever be able to escape. And if we're not,
Yeah,
fixing
and
this, then
it
it's
affects
just
every
going to
day.
be the next generation.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it affects your everyday finances, and also planning for retirement, or even planning for a family, buying a house, buying a car. Like these are major economic decisions that in student loans currently play a major factor in. So
Yeah,
I
so when
know a
you
lot of
see
people.
Hollywood complaining that no one wants to go to the movies anymore, just remember the statistics that we gave you about how much money people owe at student loans. All right, well, then I think we will wrap it up there for today. Thank you all so much for listening. This has been GEC Important Talks, hosted by the team at Global Education Connection. You can find us at our website, globaleducationconnection.org, to learn more about what we do, who we are, and how you can help support us. You can also find us on all of our social media platforms. And then, if Carter wanted to talk about our coloring book for a second.
Oh, of course. So we have our coloring book on Amazon. This is our way of being able to um, kind of share this book around the world with kids affected by conflict and natural disaster. So we're sending this book out to kids all around. Um, and it is available for sale on Amazon. If you go on there, all the proceeds of the book go directly to the nonprofit so we can continue to ship and distribute this book to more kids so that way they can draw, they can read about some interesting facts about animals, plus also they can just dive into this book and forget about any kind of problems that are going on around them and just enjoy drawing and reading. So if you feel so inclined, please go on Amazon and purchase our coloring book. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I will link the coloring book in the description of this episode. So again, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back next week. Goodbye.